So good afternoon. A very, very warm welcome in person. I thought this was never going to happen again, really, to this session on DfMA, Design for Manufacturing and Assembly. Do you know how many sessions on DfMA there have been at ZAC World of Façades? Any question? Any guess? Well, I was talking to Ahad last night, and he was telling me that this is actually the very first session on DfMA, which kind of really got me thinking, are we really doing enough as an industry, as a facade industry, when it comes to facade and DfMA? We are notoriously slow with progressing our facade design, our materials, and so on. Are we making the same mistake here? So perhaps that's just a thought that we can take through the day, and hopefully these gentlemen here will help us addressing that. So we got 5 great panelists, 5 facade experts. John, he's a Chief Commercial Officer for the Clarison Group. He committed to do most of the talking earlier on, right, John?
No, absolutely not.
Clyde works for Motts McDonald's, where he's Facade Technical Director for the Engineering Division. And Jose, he's Facade Technical Director with Engineering Practice, AKT. Nigel, he's a partner at Hawkins Brown, and he has led the DfMA overlay to the RBA plan of work. So a great asset to the panel. And finally, Alex, he's an architect with HTA Design, where he's director of DfMA. So before we really deep dive into the topics, perhaps it would be quite good to spend just a minute or so to talk about the key definitions, a bit of terminology, and perhaps where we as an industry can get guidance. And I think Nigel is the best person perhaps to kick off the discussion. But let's give the panelists a round of applause, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Saverio. So, hi everyone. I think it's all about communication, actually. I mean, it's interesting. I've been listening, there's a whole load of languages being spoken here. This is a sort of global conference. But what we have to do is have a common language and understand what we're talking about. And our industry is full of acronyms that, a lot of people don't understand. But we seem to have settled on DfMA, Design for Manufacture and Assembly, which is the process. We talk about MMC, the modern method of construction, and we've now got 7 categories that the UK government has defined on that. And I was also just going to touch on PMV, pre-manufactured value. So DfMA, I think we all sort of know, but fundamentally it comes from manufacturing. But what it's encouraging us to do, to my mind, is particularly for us as designers, I'm an architect, is to think about how we're going to build the building rather earlier than perhaps we might have done before, I think in simple terms. So let's make sure that when we're doing those early concept design sketches, that we're actually starting to think about how it's going to be manufactured and then how it's going to be assembled on site. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind. And it doesn't necessarily happen. I mean, it's good practice, but it doesn't necessarily happen that way. Then we've got we've now got, as I say, the 7 MMC categories. Most people, I think, when they talk of modular, talk about category 1, which is volumetric pre-assembly, but that is just one of the categories. There are plenty of others, and different ones of them do touch on facades. So category 1C is volumetric pods, but with the facade pre-assembled on it. It doesn't necessarily happen. Category 2C is with the facade pre-assembled, but it doesn't necessarily happen that way. Category 5 is non-structural systemized structure, non-structural systems, and so that would typically be bathroom pods, but it could also be glass facades. And I think one of the most interesting ones, I won't go through all 7 of them, but I think one of the most interesting is category 7, which is where we're starting to talk about how we incorporate digital technology, and that's so important in all of this, and I think we need to always remember that. So it includes things like bricklaying robots, which is fascinating, but also how we use BIM to improve the process. And then the last thing I was going to touch on was PMV, pre-manufactured value, and that's recognizing that no building is 100% off-site. Probably a category 1 volumetric would achieve maybe 75, possibly 80% pre-manufactured value, but there is always a combination of traditional and off-site. And I think we just got to bear that in mind when we talk about all of these things. So really, that's just to set the scene. It's about having a common vocabulary.
Great, thanks for that. John, from a facade specialist point of view, how can, in the context of the DfMA and facade, how can we as an industry assist in delivering the targets, the aspirations to build in half the time with half the carbon emission and yet 2/3 of the cost?
Yeah, well, I think the concept depends on a lot of collaboration with the supply chain, to be fair, much earlier in the phase, and I think as well tends to not help with the momentum for DfMA is a fragmented supply chain, not engaged all the way through the process, the concept architect not being involved right through the pre-construction stage. And I think, that is, we don't see that very often. We do see it occasionally, but we don't see it as often as we should. So I think for DfMA to really get some traction, I think it's collaboration. I think the concept's all about collaboration, to be fair, with the supply chain to see what's possible and to then come up with the options that can actually deliver that in the end. And as we get into the future of DfMA and we're really making it the 70% that you talked about, is we're going to probably think out of the box and think about where do we produce this and how do we do different things and how do we standardise and come up with the kit of parts to allow this to happen. And we'll talk about that later, obviously.
Sure. Jose, what's your view on that?
Well, I think it's the first thing we need to think of is the non-tangible cost saving. So when we talk about cost saving, it's what we have in mind is the cost itself. But I think the big advantage of DfMA is the quality improving that we can achieve. The lack of or the minimization of mistakes, of errors, of problems during the supply chain, and this is a cost saving at the end. But the problem is how we can quantify this cost saving. Sometimes it's difficult to convince people. But I think that if I have to highlight a concept or a benefit of DfMA I would say, is quality.
Funny enough, this is not actually in the question, but it is indeed a very important aspect. Alex, what do you think of that? Just is it in very practical terms when it comes to facade? How can we really help achieving that?
Well, I think first of all it's about understanding what DfMA is actually. As Nigel's alluded to, is about actually accepting that is also a process, but also it's a mindset as well. It's a sort of almost like a philosophy or something, and you have to understand, and then you have to accept that. I mean, the key really though is early engagement, with all the stakeholders, including the manufacturers and all the supply chain, and really that sort of that collaboration and that real collaboration, which we're going to talk about later as well, is really about developing that relationship. And then really, one of the main benefits of DfMA really is about predictability, I think, particularly in the construction sector. And that predictability, leads to a lot less waste. It's obviously a lot quicker in the delivery, and as we've already said about the better quality as well. And really, that collaboration is about, having shared values and a shared goal. Which ultimately really should be about improving these processes to make things better, not just for us, but also for the planet as well.
Okay, great, thanks. Clive?
With DfMA, it's not just, as was said, it's not just about manufacturing of complete units off-site, which we have experience of at the moment, which are incredibly powerful and very visible ways of building quickly and efficiently and with quality. But it's also the elements like the off-site unitized facade construction, which we all have been dealing with for decades now. It's not new, it's just another way of badging it. So in a way, we as a facade industry, we are well aware of DfMA, I just don't think we use it properly. Yeah. I think that's probably the message that comes out of this.
Yeah, and from your experience, these aspirations, are they realistic or are they perhaps too demanding?
I think they're realistic. I think we've got an opportunity to actually build up on the experiences we have. We're working with HTA on some very exciting projects that demonstrate how off-site manufacturing and assembly can work really well. And we're working on methods to also improve that quality in terms of the factory output. So yeah, there definitely is progress being made.
Okay.
John? Yeah, I think when we talk about 2/3 of the cost, I think there's the concept itself would get you cost savings and things like that. But I think whether 2/3 is ambitious or not, I couldn't say really. But it's the standardisation and the planning, and perhaps the off-site construction. It's not just about off-site construction, but perhaps off-site construction and the early planning of all of those things. We know, even if we're not talking about DfMA, doing those things properly and planning together as a team with a common goal, like you said, is going to really result in cost savings. But it's not just about cost savings. It's more like fixed outturn costs is what's going to be realised. So when you talk about 2/3 of savings, are you talking about 2/3 of savings of typical outturn costs, or is it of the original concept? So
Sure.
yeah, and by planning and collaborating, that's where you're going to get to that.
So the key big themes here that I heard is mindset, change of mindset. So it is a shift, it's early engagement, and it is collaboration.
Well, and I was going to say, when we talk about cost, I think it's predictability as well, isn't it? It's predictability of programme and it's predictability of cost. We're not at the risk of being having things affected by the mucky building site. We're doing it in a much more controlled environment before. As Clive was saying, a lot of this is already done in facades, but I think it's thinking about this in a slightly different way at a much earlier stage of the project process. I think that's the key.
Okay, great. That's actually a good lead to our next question. Bespoke versus standardised. What are the cost benefits which can be looked at through DfMA? Who would like to start the discussion? Alex.
Yeah, thanks, Aurelio. So for me, the issue with standardisation is, in the first instance, is what part are you going to standardise? Okay. So for me, the key really is actually looking at standardisation of interfaces in the first instance. That process will then allow a lot more interoperability and interchangeability between components, which can in themselves be bespoke. So it's not about losing identity, it's not about losing a special design. It's about actually being very careful about what you're choosing to standardise. Standardisation of geometry and standardisation of fixing. So I've done a lot of work using ETFE and also a lot of work with CLT. The work I've done with CLT was both a Category 2 panelised, building superstructures, but also Category 1 building 3D volumetric boxes. So, but all using the same fixings ultimately. So, it's not about standardisation of design in the general sense. It's about standardising particular parts and particularly starting with the interfaces.
So we go to the Quito part discussion.
Yes.
Yeah. Jose, you...
I think that the dichotomy between bespoke and standardization it's not so straightforward, because in the metal facade, in the curtain wall systems, for example, we have been designing with pretty standard systems for the performance part, and then we were customizing all the architectural side. So I don't see any reason why we can't do the same with other systems. So I think the key point here is designing with this in mind, designing with a clear difference between the performance scheme, let's say, and the architectural one, and engaging, obviously, the industry on it.
And do you have any examples, or any of you, do you have any particular examples that is particularly applicable to facade when it comes to addressing this standardization, a particular component?
Well, I think one thing I was going to say, Alex, practice and mine are working together on a very interesting piece of work, looking at standardising assemblies, sub-assemblies, and indeed whole apartments in the residential sector. And so we're looking at standardising sub-assemblies. We're looking at things like bathroom pods and utility risers, but obviously we're also looking at the facade. And one of those components is balconies in the residential sector. Why do we redesign these things every time? They're fundamentally very similar one to the other. It's not to say you can't change the look and feel of them, but it's the method of fixing and the sort of broad makeup. So I was going to say architects tend to run away terrified when we say standardisation, because we all like to think our buildings are bespoke and designed specially every time. Well, I think there's a message which I think architects shouldn't be afraid of standardisation, because we're not saying that buildings all have to look the same. What we are doing there, I think going back to what Alex was touching on, is that it's perhaps the parts that it's the interfaces that we need to standardise. It's what we don't necessarily see. And in fact, if we do that, we're making, because we're not having to reinvent the wheel every time, we're actually making more time for ourselves to do that sort of really interesting, the aesthetic place-making pieces of work that
Sure.
we want to make the buildings look fantastic and sit in their environment comfortably. So I think, talking for us as architects, I think we need to get over this slight concern about standardisation. It's not affecting how the buildings look. It's actually making things rather more productive in the way that we design and manufacture and assemble.
So we need to turn that into an opportunity.
Absolutely, it's a positive. It absolutely has to be a positive,
Okay.
yeah.
What does that mean for you as?
We all know, we've all experienced spending a lot of time figuring out performance specifications and how to achieve them on a project-by-project basis, and that's exactly what we're talking about. And I do think, perhaps one of the starting points is to standardise or have a very sort of standard suite of performance specifications for different types of building, and then you could replicate things like slab edge conditions and things like that, which we all seem to reinvent the wheel every time we do a building, and I think that's what it's about. And I think also we could, you could have a building which is very standard in its design, very optimised, and I think we've talked about this in one of the previous acts before. And but it's only standardised or optimised for that one project. So how can it be? And this is not a subject about carbon or anything like that, but if we're ever going to really harness carbon efficiency, we've got to think about reusing buildings and repurposing buildings after their end of use. So you can only do that if you standardise a lot of that, and that's probably way off in the future, but essentially that's what we need to be thinking about now.
Sure. Clive and Jose, I mean, your role to assist at early stages, how can we influence that?
So what occurred to me is one of the things that happens all the time, every project we test, every single system as if it's new, as if it's unique, and that becomes a problem. It becomes a burden on the project, it becomes a burden on everybody. And there are lots of synergies with lots of different systems. The same system can be used for lots of different ways. And there's got to be more understanding about what the systems do and how they work, so that we don't have this constant re-evaluation of what's already been done, because that's one of the biggest problems in the industry at the moment. There's lack of trust with what the information that comes across.
It's about risk management.
And it's about risk management, and I think that is something that could be addressed by the system manufacturers. I don't think we can do it by the designs themselves, but I think it will help a lot with some of the goals that we're trying to establish.
Okay, Jose?
I think we need to learn from. I mean, DfMA is not new. I mean, we need to learn from other industries, like automotive industry, for example. If you look at any brand, they basically have different models sharing the same engine, or sharing the same bracket system, or sharing the same. So I think we have to apply, and we do. In a particular case, the same concept. So we start from very well proven and tested. Certified systems to provide the necessary performances we need, but then from there we always have a possibility to incorporate the architectural intent. But I think the key here is reducing the testing, the times, etc. Everything related to performances and fabrication, quality control, etc.
Alex,
Yes, very. So I just wanted to add as well that, so for me, standardisation is also to do with the process, okay, particularly with regards to the DfMA. So it's not just the design, but it's about standardising the way that you approach a project and then repeating that. But what's really critical is that you build in a methodology that allows for feedback and learning, so that you can embed continuous improvement into that process, so that for the next project, whilst you're doing the same process, you're doing it just slightly better, and then the next project after that, you're doing it even better. So you're always on a journey towards making that more efficient and more optimised.
And have you managed to do that in reality, or
yeah, absolutely.
Is there some particular thing that we need to embrace?
Yeah, so some of my early work, I moved from architecture into project management and started work with a company called Vector Foil Tech, who do the TFE envelopes. So one of the very first projects we worked on was the Eden project down in Cornwall. We're now, well, Vector Fortech, I was with them for a long time. Vector Fortech are now expanding quite rapidly across North America, doing ETFE envelopes for very large stadiums, football stadiums, etc. now. And, you know, I think they still use the same set of 5 standard details that we developed back in 2000. But if you look on their website, you'll see there are thousands of projects all around the world, and none of them are the same. But it's the same standard 5 typical details.
So it can be done. I'm sure we're all struggling to conceive why every time we redesign everything and we end up with 100 dies on every project. Right, so that is perhaps a challenge that we all need to take away and build upon. Okay, so the role of the stakeholders and their involvement to enhance collaboration and better product, how can we improve on that? What do we need to do, Jose?
Well, I think they should be the first interested, because it's their money at the end of the day. And probably if we explain better the concept, they will. This is connected to my first comment about the non-tangible cost savings. So if we convince them about the advantages of controlling the quality, controlling the procurement process in a more rational way, they will be surely engaged. But I think also the industry has a very important role on this, because basically I think we need standards. We need to create some standards as it happens in other parts of this industry. For example, all the hardware for Windows, for those, they have certain standards, so you can exchange, you can use the hardware from this supplier in this system from other suppliers. So, I don't know.
Yeah, bracketry. And we talked about, when we were preparing for this, we were talking about all of the different things that we talked about unitized bracketry. Why does it have to be different every time? You know, why does slab edge conditions need to be different every single time? Why does cladding zones need to be different every single time? And of course they do for certain aspects of buildings, we understand that. But it doesn't mean you can have a suite of standardised solutions which we all understand and don't have to keep repeating the process every single time. But I think the stakeholder involvement is really important. I think obviously it takes a lot of trust, and it's not like we don't do that already. We do it to a big extent. You know, everybody gets involved in PCSA arrangements and that sort of thing, all part of the design process, usually later on in the process. But I always wondered whether it should be a little bit earlier, maybe at the design concept phase, and a wider team is assembled. That is really held on to much longer, right through the pre-construction phase, really. And I think that's the only way it's going to gain traction, and other aspects won't unhinge it, cost, certainty and things like that, yeah.
What else do we need to change? Because it's true, I mean, other industry, we talk about DfMA first session today, but design for manufacturing coming together with design for assembly, it is something that, as we were saying earlier, it's been around in the car industry for decades. That's where it started.
Yeah.
So, but they do have different approaches. They do have different collaboration approaches and a different collaboration spirit. They share platform. They share. What do we need to change?
Change is tricky, but it is a very different mindset. I mean, we at HTA are working on projects where the client is the developer, is the manufacturer, and from the very outset, he's started with a collaboration process, which has resulted in significantly accelerated construction times. And it's impressive the way they organise their business flow, and the impressive the way they organise their factory and how they prove everything and prove the design. And I think that's a lesson, but it's a very different mindset to the traditional build. And we can see that in complete contrast. So, for example, we've got 2 buildings very similar. One building's been designed, completed, and installed and turnkeyed before the other buildings got onto site. And that's the same sort of scale of buildings. So very, very different mindsets, and I think it's very difficult to switch that mindset between a traditional build contractor and the way that we're looking at these DfMA projects that we and HTA are looking at. They're very different.
But why is it difficult?
I think there's so many variables. I think uncertainty of projects going ahead. I think assembling a larger team to be involved in that early design phase has obviously got cost And you know, if you're uncertain of when a project is going to go ahead, or you want a faster return of investment, it could be problematic. So I think we see on most projects where there's unitised or there's modular construction, there's a much longer leading period, and there's this sort of involvement and these sort of discussions happening quite successfully. But beyond that, there's a lot of variables which could stop that.
Well, for me, it starts really at procurement. Okay, so I mean that's procurement of materials, procurement of services, procurement of labour. Currently, we've spent the last 20, 30 years all learning how to be very adversarial in the design and build contracting environment, and the corresponding behaviours that go with that, which is basically everybody effectively turning their back on each other and doing an inverse type of collaboration, which actually was all about individuals rather than the collective. So I think getting the procurement models right in the first instance is something that we all need to sort of be taking a look at, and that is actually being led currently by which it needs to be led by high-level stakeholder engagement, government and policy. So there's increasing amounts that's coming through from that high level. But just want to say, it's all really fundamentally based on collaboration, really, and that's a term that's getting increasingly bounded around by people that we need to collaborate. More collaboration is required. For me, collaboration also has to be taught and learned. Okay, I mean it's not natural. As I say, we've all actually moved ourselves into an inverse collaborating situation because of the D&B environment. Collaboration requires honesty. It requires openness. It needs to be developed and it needs to be grown like any relationship does, and for it to be successful. You have to keep working at it, and that's just to go back to this sort of this continuous improvement and building in methods whereby you look back at what you've done and you identify the good things, but you also pick out the bad things and then look to improve those for the next time. And actually, that's what will build confidence and will build a strong relationship and good collaboration.
Mm. It's interesting because you dropped in the D&B. So is it perhaps? I don't know how we're going to change that. Is it perhaps a different form of contract? Do we need to start looking at that? Nigel,
Well, I mean, potentially we can. I think that's going to prove very difficult commercially because the fact is clients like that sort of cost certainty that they get from D&B. But of course, I completely agree with Alex. Procurement is a big issue here because D&B really fundamentally prevents us as architects from getting those manufacturers and suppliers next to us during the concept design stage. We just can't do it very easily. So we do need to change that. Certainly some of the more enlightened clients are understanding the value that they get from doing that and are helping to do that. I think there's another P which slightly holds us back, and that's planning. Because for most projects there is planning risk, there is considerable risk at planning. So clients are unwilling to engage a full design team until they've got over that big hurdle. So we're often on our own. We're very lucky if we have engineers working with us at times, to be honest. And what that means is that when we get planning permission, we perhaps have a building which is not fully coordinated, let alone thinking about the detail of the facade. And you can end up with a building which is somewhat different in appearance. If you look at the CGIs that you get at planning stage, they can be quite different to what's actually built. And that's a bit of a problem in managing stakeholders' expectations. So we need to be encouraging our clients to procure earlier and procure the full design team and to bring on board the suppliers as well to work side by side with this. It goes back to that collaboration point. So we've got to persuade them the value of that and to try and move away from reliance just on D&B because it makes life very difficult for us in a DfMA world.
Sure. It sounds like that's certainly the case. You were laughing at some of the things you were saying. Did you see that as an opportunity? Do you agree? Or?
No, because I totally agree. I think we need to be more and more involved in pre-planning design, and it's changing. It's changing. We are receiving more and more requests for.
I mean, I think it does differ depending on the sector as well. So, if we're working in, for example, further education, higher education, where perhaps it's in a campus of buildings and planning is not necessarily such a risk because there is largely a degree of understanding with the local authority. When we're working on residential projects, they tend to be more speculative And of course, you know, what the developer wants you to do is to maximise the value of the site, and that means pushing the boundaries on planning, and that means it's more risky, and they know that. So, you know, getting the full design team engaged, as I say, let alone sort of constructors and manufacturers, is quite hard, but it's what we've got to work out.
So by pushing those boundaries, then are we at risk of limiting DfMA
We've got to demonstrate the value, I think. This is the thing, and demonstrate the value for. We were talking earlier on about circular economies and so on. We're not even thinking about how we're building them, let alone how we're going to be taking them down in many cases. But we've really got to get over that if we're going to get better carbon outcomes and you know, derive more value in the long term for the building's life cycle.
Just to connect to that value statement, is it, you know, which is the next question, is it the new value engineering tool? Is it value engineering? Is it new? I mean, what?
We talked about this, didn't we, before? And well, so architects don't like standardisation, but they also don't like value engineering because, you know, when someone says value engineering, what they usually mean is cost cutting. And it usually means that you've got to a point where you're about to build the building or that sort of point and you found that you can't afford what you've got. So DfMA is a solution to this because you are thinking at an earlier stage about how you're going to build it. It's critical to have that cost input at an early stage, so the client needs to be persuaded to have the full services of a good quantity surveyor, cost consultant, and you develop the design, both understanding how it's going to be built and understanding how much it's going to be cost. And you do that iteratively. It doesn't have to be completely firmed up at the beginning, but you're gradually, progressively fixing the design. And I think a DfMA approach gives you that. I mean, as I say, this is really what it's all about. It's about this front-loading of thinking, and it may be even thinking about not just one project, but programs of projects. And I mean, I know that you've been doing this to some extent, Alex, that it's thinking about not just the one that you're doing now, but what's the next one going to be, and looking for continuous
improvement. And what can you
improvement.
apply from one to the other?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, I completely agree. I mean, you know, value engineering is synonymous with, you know, cost, but also quality cutting, I think, ultimately, and that's part of the D&B, you know, contracting environment. And actually, you know, it's all part of this sort of adversarial behaviour that then starts sort of materialising, which then just makes everything worse, actually. I mean, you know, for me, hard value engineering is actually inherent in DfMA, okay? It's part of the DfMA process, so you don't actually have to do it afterwards. You've already done it if you've actually gone through a DfMA process. And for me, you know, in terms of these new definitions and, you know, and actually, you know, how we communicate, you know, I would prefer to suggest that it should be, you know, we should be talking about value enhancing rather than value engineering. You know, and there are lots of very, again, you know, high-level stakeholder-led initiatives by government, and the Construction Innovation Hub have recently issued the Value Toolkit, which is a very useful tool. You know, I mean, you know, really, when we're talking about value, we need to be talking not just about the cost, not just about the quality, but we need to be talking about social value. We need to be talking about the value in terms of the sustainability and the contribution that it's actually making toward making things better and not making things worse. And that's real value, I would say.
That's what it sounds like. Nobody likes value engineering, but we keep doing it. So maybe we need to have a session on that at some point. But Jose, what's your take on that?
I think, as you say, value engineering is a concept which has a bad reputation nowadays, and it shouldn't be like that. I think the cost saving, and this is a result of the real value engineering. The cost saving is a collateral benefit. I think the real point is the assuring quality, assuring securing performances, securing lead times, which it doesn't necessarily mean that the lead times are going to be shorter. It means that they are confirmed. And I think at the end this will bring, and this is the real value engineering, at the end this will bring the cost saving, because you are removing risk, reducing risk, avoiding issues, avoiding problems.
So the stress is again all at that front stage, at the beginning, very early collaboration, change in mindset, and so on. It seems to be, the focus seems to be there. That's what we need to change. And
keeping control from the beginning. Keeping control from the beginning. Yeah.
Okay. Clive, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. I really haven't got much more to add on that one. So it's where we are at the moment. I think there's a great opportunity with DfMA, which I don't think we've grasped yet, certainly in this room. And I think it's maybe more discussions will be had in the future along these lines.
And an example, a practical example when it comes to facade for that, what would that be? A typical example of what we need to...
Well, I think probably we go back to looking at, if we are developing assemblies, sub-assemblies and so on before the project started, and we're using them on more than one project, that's sort of value engineering, isn't it? Because it's inherent in, we are being more productive in the design process. We're definitely going to be more productive in the manufacturing and assembly process. So I think the more we can start thinking about programs of work where there is an opportunity for that, and many clients do have that opportunity, and indeed, as consultants, we can be developing our own standardised ways of working and components and so on. I talked about that piece of work that Alex and I are working on together. So I think that's where we can drive out this. Value engineering is not wrong. It's just that it's become wrong because people don't do it until it's too late. So we have to sort of embrace it, perhaps, and say, well, look, it's fine, but let's start VE right from RIVA stage 2, right from the first sort of pencil sketch. Let's be thinking about what value is and where we're spending the money in the right way, and thinking about how that relates to, the facade is obviously a fundamental part of the placemaking and look and feel of a building. If you don't spend, you've got to understand where you're adding value, and you could argue that that's a good place to start.
But perhaps isn't that maybe more efficient engineering as opposed to value engineering? Or rather, it is engineering of value rather than value engineering, because it's always about cutting costs when it comes to most of the players in the industry.
Absolutely. I think it's just doing things at the right time, isn't it? And understanding value is not something which you do sort of in the production stage. It's something you do early on and then progressively through the design process.
Yeah, it's an enabling concept that allows value engineering or easier realisations of costs and we've said this, costs, outturn costs to be realised very early, but it has to start at that very, very early stage, and because otherwise you could be changing the entire design of a building really later on, and thinking about DfMA at that stage, but close to procurement it's just not going to work. So it has to start right at the beginning of the concept.
One of the things that we discussed offline was actually are we at risk of, with all these processes, standardization and value engineering, are we at risk of ending up with having a number of buildings perhaps all looking the same? I think as you were making perhaps a kind of a reference to certain buildings which may end up all the same. Is that a risk?
It could be, but it isn't. I mean, I think, there is a concern, again, going back to my profession, I think there is a concern that if you're building volumetric buildings that they're going to look a little bit boxy, but they don't have to be as long as you consider it early enough, to go back to that point. So no, I don't think we should be concerned. And it's all we're doing is we are standardising go back to the point about the connections between components, we're standardising components. It's not meaning that you're going to have a standardised facade. In fact, quite the opposite. I think, if you're saving time from some of the sort of legwork that we do on every building, actually you've got more time to spend on focusing on the design quality and coming up with a creative solution. So I think that's what we've got to focus on.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's an interesting one joining up with the discussion about planning earlier on, and how in this country, in the UK, we like to use solid masonry brickwork. And actually, there's a character that actually people aspire towards. People want it to look the same. And that's why we do lots of brickwork in this country. I mean, personally, I prefer to try different things. But so yeah, I mean, I think it's about finding a balance. And it's it's not that it's necessarily going to be one way or the other. I think there will always be a necessity to have traditional methods and traditional construction. In fact, there are probably very few projects that actually don't have a combination of both, that actually aren't a hybrid between traditional and modern methods of construction. And I think it's about bringing those things together and working at that interface as well.
Yeah, that's a great way.
And the structure you can't see is the first focus, isn't it? And you mentioned that.
And we've seen how bad that can, how terribly bad that can really go.
Yes.
I think there's another aspect which, as an industry, we need to focus on, and that's, we talk about interoperability, and we need to have greater interoperability between the components that we are specifying, so that sometimes clients are concerned, I think, with, perhaps particularly with Category 1, maybe less so Category 2, of single sourcing, and what happens if that business isn't around when we come to build the building. We need to have greater interoperability between our systems so that you can effectively have a design knowing that there is more than one solution to this. And so it's developing British standards and so on that allow us to specify without the fear of... so we get the benefit of standardisation, but without the concern over single sourcing.
Does that present a challenge in terms of what you guys specify? When it comes to writing the specification and the referencing? And
Not necessary, not necessary. As I said before, we have examples in the industry where we are applying the same concept, the same approach, like hardware, for example. So I think it's just a little change in the mentality of the industry, generally speaking. Also designers, architects, but clients, etc.
all stakeholders.
But for us, I think we can do it, but we need to be allowed to do it.
Okay. Clive, does that present a challenge for you?
No, I think it's what we're already doing at the moment. I think we're doing it. We're looking at buildings where we have specifications for elements, and we are making. And part of that specification is to verify that the performance is there when you've actually built the thing. And there is a certain synergy with a different mindset between some of the buildings we're doing, which are modular construction, and some of the buildings we're doing, which are traditional build. They're very different. And maybe it's the alignment of those two that's where some of the work needs to be done. But at the moment, they are two different directions. And it's bringing those back together, I think, that may be where the difficulty for us is, anyway, in our work.
Okay. I just have one final question for every single one of you. Just 20 seconds, one sentence for the audience. What is the key takeaway? What's, for you, the one thing?
I think the key takeaway is early engagement and collaboration with the supply chain.
Yeah.
Key point is that it's not difficult to do DfMA if you have the right attitude towards it. I think it's just recognising it and setting it out properly as you plan your work.
Yeah. Very facade specific. What?
Put the value on quality and early control of procurement process.
Okay. Nigel, your key takeaway?
I think I go back to that point I made at the beginning about having a common vocabulary for us to use. I think, if we're going to develop these ideas, we've got to be speaking the same language. So let's use those MMC categories, understanding where facades fit into those issues. And, we've got a common term, DfMA, I think now has emerged. So let's keep hammering away at that so that we're all talking the same language.
Last but not least, Alex.
Thanks, Vario. Well, so for me, everybody, there is a very, very real climate emergency, and we need to act now. Okay, so it's not about waiting around for someone else to do it. We all need to engage, and we all need to act now, as soon as possible. Okay, and the very final thing we'll say is enjoy your lunch.
Okay, great. Many thanks. We just draw this to a close. Okay, thank you.